There was a kind of rhythm to their friendship that felt unspoken but immovable, a pattern of glances and shared laughter, of long walks that never led anywhere in particular, of conversations that stretched well past midnight and circled everything but the one thing they both knew was quietly growing between them. Nadia had always drawn clear lines, not just with him, but with the world, lines that kept things defined, safe, separate. And Aiden, in the beginning, had respected those boundaries, even when the air between them grew too warm, even when her smile lingered just long enough to blur the edges of what they were pretending to be. She told him early on, with that careful tone people use when they don't want to be misread but already suspect they might be. "I'm not looking for anything serious. I just like our friendship the way it is." And he nodded, not because he didn't want more, but because he wanted her, even if that meant accepting less than he hoped for, even if it meant sitting in silence when she spoke about other men, even if it meant swallowing the ache that came every time she reached for him with her eyes but not with her hands. They met in the most ordinary way, through friends, a casual introduction at a birthday party neither of them had really wanted to attend, but something about that evening, about the way their conversation had spiraled away from small talk into something stranger, deeper, more intimate, had shifted the ground beneath them before either realized they were standing on anything fragile. What followed wasn't dramatic. They didn't fall into some whirlwind romance or cross lines they couldn't uncross. Instead, they became close in that delicate, in-between kind of way that only works as long as no one asks for more. But something changed, slowly, quietly, and it wasn't her. It was him. Aiden, who had always been patient, always willing to wait, began to grow tired of pretending the hours they spent together didn't mean anything, of holding space for a feeling that never got to speak its name. He didn't say it outright. He never confessed, never pushed, never asked her to reconsider. But he started to pull back, just slightly, missing a few of their usual calls, answering her messages with shorter replies, choosing not to linger after dinner like he used to. And when she asked if something was wrong, he smiled and said he'd just been busy, that everything was fine, and for a while she believed him. Then he met someone. Her name was Camille. She was thoughtful, easy to talk to, and kind in a way that didn't ask for anything in return. Nadia met her once, briefly, unexpectedly, at a cafe where they all happened to end up together. And something in the way Camille leaned toward Aiden when she laughed, in the way he looked at her when she wasn't speaking, made something deep in Nadia's chest clench before she could even name the reason. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was something more disorienting. A realization, perhaps, that the safety she had always found in Aiden's presence, in the way he was always there, waiting, steady, warm, might not belong to her forever. And for the first time, the boundaries she'd drawn so carefully began to feel like walls closing in instead of lines keeping her safe. That night, she went home alone, sat in the dark of her living room, and realized that she had never once imagined what her life would feel like without him in it. Because somewhere along the way, she had started to believe he'd always be there. Even when she gave him every reason not to be. It wasn't until he started being unavailable that she realized just how many of her days were built around the quiet expectation that he would be, how many decisions were made with the assumption that Aiden would answer her text within minutes, that he'd say yes to lunch, that he'd walk beside her just to nowhere in particular, that she could send him voice notes in the middle of the night and know, without needing a response, that he had heard them. And now, without warning or permission, that rhythm had shifted, subtly at first, but unmistakably. He no longer responded instantly. He no longer sent her playlists with hidden meanings tucked between the tracks. He no longer looked at her with that almost smile that had always felt like a shared secret. Instead, his attention, once effortless and quietly all-encompassing, had become measured, split, careful. And she hated that she noticed. Hated that the change made her stomach twist, that the image of Camille's hand resting on his shoulder kept replaying in her mind, that the sound of his voice when he spoke to someone else had started to sound like something that didn't belong to her anymore, as if it ever had. She wanted to say something, but what could she possibly say that wouldn't make her a hypocrite? She had drawn the lines. She had declared, clearly and without hesitation, that they were just friends, only friends, and she had done so without ever considering that friendship, too, was something that could be lost. That proximity, once taken for granted, might one day belong to someone else. That affection, no matter how unspoken, doesn't wait forever. So she said nothing. She smiled when he mentioned Camille. She nodded when he said they'd been seeing more of each other. She even complimented her once, sincerely, painfully, and watched as something inside her cracked, not with drama, but with the soft, slow break of something that had been stretched too thin for too long. The distance between them didn't happen all at once. It came like fog, slowly creeping in from the edges, until one day she looked around and couldn't remember when she'd last felt seen. The daily texts stopped. The check-ins became rare. The jokes turned polite. And the silences, once companionable, became loaded with all the things they no longer knew how to say. And yet, she missed him. In the kind of way that made her feel foolish, because he hadn't gone anywhere, not really. He still responded. Still smiled. Still stood next to her at group dinners. But his absence now had nothing to do with geography. It was emotional, cellular, a space he used to fill by simply being available. And she had only realized how much she had leaned on that, how much she had quietly, selfishly counted on it, when it began to fade. One evening, they ran into each other by accident, at a bookstore they used to visit together. It had been weeks since they'd last spoken properly, and when she looked up from a shelf and saw him standing there, holding a copy of a book she once recommended, her breath caught, not because he looked different, but because he didn't. He looked exactly the same, and yet the space between them felt unrecognizable. He smiled. Asked how she was. She gave some version of good, and asked about Camille, about work, about the new guitar he'd posted once and never mentioned again. It was all so normal. So unbearably normal. And when she turned to go, thinking the moment was over, he reached out and touched her arm, lightly, but enough to stop her. He said her name. Just her name. And in that single word, she felt everything that hadn't been said hanging in the air between them. She looked at him, really looked, and said, not as a challenge, not as a confession, but as a quiet unraveling. I didn't think I'd miss you like this. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Then he asked. Why didn't you ever say anything? And she could have said 100 things in that moment, about fear, about pride, about how she'd spent so long protecting herself from the very thing she now found herself aching for. But what came out was the only truth that mattered. Because I thought you'd always be there anyway. And it wasn't an apology. It was a grief. The grief of someone who had misunderstood what love requires, not just feeling, not just closeness, but choice. The active, terrifying choice to risk. He didn't tell her what she wanted to hear. He didn't step closer. He didn't say her name like a promise. But he didn't walk away either. He just stood there, eyes soft, voice quiet, and said. I waited a long time, Nadia. Longer than you know. And she nodded. Because now, she knew. Some friendships survive silence. Others teach us that silence is the end. But the hardest ones. They ask us what we're willing to lose. For the comfort of never saying how we truly feel.